Hello everyone and welcome to the Takecraft channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. Today we are going to discuss the movie The Lion King from 2019. The vast sunlit plains of the Pride Lands shimmered under an African dawn, a cradle for the next generation of rulers. We watch a young lion cub, Simba, heir to the majestic throne, presented by his father Mufasa to the assembled kingdom. Mufasa, a figure whose very presence commanded respect, a lion whose reign was marked by balance and wisdom, qualities forged from a life dedicated to upholding the circle of life, held his son aloft. Simba, brimming with the irrepressible energy of youth, soon finds a foil in Scar, his calculating uncle. Scar, whose perceived marginalization from the royal lineage fueled a bitter ambition, often paints dark pictures of the elephant graveyard, a desolate place forbidden by Mufasa. Scar's narrative, often laced with sardonic wit, belied a deep-seated resentment that had shadowed his own artistic, albeit destructive, inclinations. He always seemed to prefer the shadows to the spotlight Mufasa naturally commanded. Driven by curiosity and a thirst for adventure, Simba, accompanied by his spirited friend Nala, ventures into the Forbidden Lands. They are ambushed by the hyenas, Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed, henchmen whose loyalty was bought by Scar's promises of power. Mufasa, ever the vigilant protector, intervenes in a spectacular display of leonine strength, saving his son and reinforcing the dangers that lurk beyond the borders of their responsibility. Scar, undeterred, plots a more elaborate catastrophe. He manipulates Simba into a gorge, a trap sprung during a wildebeest stampede. The sheer volume of the fleeing animals was overwhelming, a testament to nature's indifferent power. Mufasa rushes in, a titan battling chaos, saving his son only to be betrayed by Scar at the precipice. The fall echoes the silent collapse of order in the Pride Lands. Simba, shell-shocked and guilt-ridden, flees the Pride Lands. He is found near death by Timon and Pumbaa, a meerkat and a warthog duo whose philosophy of Hakuna Matata, no worries, offers a seductive, if escapist, alternative to responsibility. Their vibrant, carefree existence in the jungle provides a necessary balm for the traumatized cub, allowing him to mature away from the burdens of kingship, their easygoing camaraderie serving as a temporary sanctuary. Years pass. Simba grows into a powerful young lion, his past effectively buried under the lush canopy. However, the past, much like the relentless African sun, eventually forces its way through. Nala, now a young adult, stumbles upon him. She is starving, having fled the desiccated, overhunted Pride Lands ruled by Scar, whose mismanagement and reliance on the hyenas have poisoned the land. Nala's plea is urgent, a stark contrast to the easy life Simba has adopted. The pivotal moment arrives when Rafiki, the wise mandrill shaman whose connection to the spirits was legendary, guides Simba back to his true self. In a poignant encounter, Rafiki helps Simba communicate with the spectral image of Mufasa. The spectral lion's message is clear. The past can sting, but one must learn from it and reclaim one's place. It is a call to accept the mantle of legacy. Galvanized, Simba returns home, an exile reclaiming his birthright. The Pride Lands are unrecognizable, a desolate wasteland under a perpetual twilight, testament to Scar's tyrannical, short-sighted rule. Simba confronts Scar, who tries to shift the blame for Mufasa's death onto Simba once more. Cornered and facing the truth, Simba asserts his identity, reclaiming the mantle of kingship. The ensuing battle is desperate. Simba fights not just for himself, but for the very soul of the land. He finally defeats Scar, casting him out, only to have Scar meet his end at the hands of the very hyenas whose loyalty he betrayed. With Scar gone, and the reins returning, Simba ascends Pride Rock. He roars, a sound that resonates across the rejuvenated plains, signaling not just a change in leadership, but the renewal of the circle of life, a promise fulfilled to his father and his kingdom. The early scenes on Pride Rock are bathed in an almost devotional light, emphasizing the sacred nature of the succession. Mufasa himself embodies the archetype of the classical ruler, his movements deliberate, his voice resonating with the gravity of his office, a figure whose entire being is devoted to ecological stewardship, a concept he painstakingly tries to instill in the playful yet often distracted Simba. His dedication is less about personal glory and more about maintaining the grand, interconnected tapestry of existence. Scar, meanwhile, is the embodiment of thwarted artistry and intellectual vanity. His dialogue drips with a refined cynicism, a performance art played out in the shadows beneath the great baobab trees. One can sense the years spent watching his more charismatic, physically imposing brother occupy the center stage, fueling a resentment that festers like a slow poison. His plots are intricate, mirroring a twisted kind of theatrical staging, where the stampede is his grand finale, designed to achieve the ultimate dramatic reversal. When Simba flees, the transition from the vibrant, if burdened, Pride Lands to the jungle habitat of Timon and Pumbaa is jarring. The jungle is a riot of color and excess, the antithesis of the structured savanna. Timon, the quick-witted meerkat, whose survival has always depended on outmaneuvering predators with sheer verbal agility, finds an eager student in the grieving cub. Pumbaa, the gentle giant whose emotional capacity often overwhelms his physical presence, offers uncomplicated affection. Their philosophy, Hakuna Matata, is initially a necessary anesthetic for Simba's trauma, a forced forgetting that allows him to grow muscles without carrying the weight of destiny. The reunion with Nala is fraught with the awkwardness of two people meeting after diverging radically. Nala's appearance is harsh. The lushness of her earlier life has been stripped away. She carries the visible scars of famine, a living testament to the failed stewardship of the Pride Lands. Her energy is sharp, focused by necessity, contrasting sharply with the almost languid ease Simba has cultivated. Her voice, when pleading with him, carries the brittle edge of desperation. Rafiki's intervention is less a command and more a gentle, persistent unveiling. The old mandrill, whose life has been spent observing cycles of decay and rebirth, understands that trauma seals the spirit. The scene with Mufasa's spirit is handled with an ethereal quality, emphasizing the timelessness of the father's wisdom. Mufasa doesn't scold. He reminds Simba of his innate capabilities, his voice carrying the assurance of a seasoned mentor speaking to a promising but hesitant protege. It is the moment the actor realizes the role he was born to play requires genuine commitment, not just imitation. Simba's return is marked by a profound sense of obligation overriding lingering fear. The desolation of the Pride Lands under Scar is palpable. The air feels stale, the ground cracked. When Simba confronts Scar, the atmosphere is thick with accusation and inherited pain. Scar's final desperate gambit, projecting the guilt onto Simba, is the last gasp of a manipulator whose stagecraft has finally failed him. When Simba roars his acceptance of the truth, it is not merely a display of dominance but a cathartic release. The battle that follows is chaotic and visceral, a necessary purging. The final image of Simba on Pride Rock, silhouetted against a recovering sky, is the quiet triumph of endurance over calculated malice, the establishment of a natural order finally restored by a king who has genuinely earned his stripes through suffering and self-acceptance. The initial gathering on Pride Rock felt less like a political event and more like a sacred communion, the very light seeming to bless the lineage. Mufasa, the elder statesman of the savannah, moved with the practiced grace of a seasoned performer who understands the power of stillness. His authority wasn't imposed, it was inherent, reflecting decades spent mastering the complex choreography of ecological interdependence. He wasn't merely a king, he was the conductor of the natural symphony, keenly aware that every creature from the smallest dung beetle to the largest elephant had a vital, unchangeable score to play. His efforts to impart this wisdom to young Simba were earnest, though often met with the boundless, easily diverted attention of a cub still more interested in chasing butterflies than boundaries. Scar, by contrast, was the quintessential understudy, perpetually simmering in the wings. His intellect, sharp and cutting, was ultimately turned inward, manifesting as bitter envy. He possessed the soul of a frustrated playwright, seeing the world only in terms of dramatic conflict and personal slight. His elegance was brittle, a veneer easily cracked by genuine warmth or uncomplicated happiness, which he associated only with his brother's unwarranted success. His whispers about the elephant graveyard were expertly crafted pieces of dramatic exposition designed to tempt the hero into the first act of tragedy. The foray into the graveyard was a masterclass in youthful recklessness, the air thick with the scent of dust and danger. The hyenas, Shenzi, whose leadership was characterized by pragmatic cruelty, and Banzai, driven by raw hunger, represented the unbridled, chaotic idea that Scar secretly admired. Mufasa's intervention was not just rescue. It was a visceral, cinematic demonstration of what true selfless responsibility looked like, a stark contrast to Scar's transactional motivations. The stampede was Scar's magnum opus of manipulation, an almost operatic disaster orchestrated for maximum emotional impact. When Mufasa fell, it wasn't just a physical impact. It was the sudden, horrifying silence after a massive crescendo. For Simba, the ensuing flight was a self-imposed exile fueled by a guilt so profound it became his new identity. Timon and Pumbaa, emerging from the dense jungle, were the embodiment of buoyant escapism. Timon, the hyper-articulate survivor, used his constant stream of jokes and observations as a defense mechanism against any hint of seriousness. Pumbaa, large and surprisingly tender, provided a non-judgmental anchor. Their ethos, Hakuna Matata, was the perfect, albeit temporary, palliative for a soul in shock, allowing Simba the space to develop physical prowess free from the crushing weight of ancestral expectation. The re-entry of Nala into Simba's insulated world was a sudden, painful collision between fantasy and reality. Her lean frame and hardened gaze spoke volumes about the kingdom's suffering. The vibrant jungle paradise suddenly felt hollow against the stark truth of the desiccated pride lands she described. Her appeal was not merely emotional, it was an indictment of Simba's prolonged absence, forcing him to confront the cost of his own comfort. Rafiki acted as the necessary catalyst, the wise therapist who knows that healing requires confrontation. His methods were layered, rooted in ancient wisdom. The vision of Mufasa, shimmering and timeless, bypassed the logical mind and spoke directly to the primal core of Simba's identity. Mufasa's voice was not booming. It was imbued with the quiet authority of immutable truth, a final masterclass delivered across the veil, compelling Simba to step onto the stage he had avoided for so long. Simba's return was fraught with an almost unbearable tension. The Pride Lands, choked by Scar's selfish greed, were an environmental ruin, mirroring the inner devastation Scar had engineered. The final confrontation was agonizingly personal. When Scar attempted to rewrite history one last time, using the same manipulative tactics that caused the initial break, Simba's assertion of truth, his declaration of his true lineage and his father's memory, was the ultimate act of theatrical redemption. The ensuing fight was less a strategic battle and more a desperate wrestling match against suffocating despair. When Scar finally met his end, it was a fitting, ironic footnote delivered by the very henchman he had so carelessly discarded. Simba's final roar atop Pride Rock was not merely a sound, it was the declarative sentence concluding a long, arduous narrative, marking the solemn, beautiful return of stewardship and the slow, certain promise of renewal. The rains, when they finally broke over the barren expanse, were not a sudden deluge but a measured, cleansing shower, mirroring the slow healing process of the land itself. Simba, now fully inhabiting the role of king, presided over this transformation with a quiet gravity that spoke of lessons learned in harsh solitude. His presence on Pride Rock was less about asserting dominance and more about embodying stability. He moved with the understanding that a ruler's power is inextricably linked to the health of the ecosystem they oversee. The early days were characterized by a meticulous, almost tireless effort to restore the balance Scar and the hyenas had so recklessly shattered. He worked alongside the lionesses, his movements fluid and engaged, a stark departure from the privileged detachment Scar had exhibited. Nala, standing near him, was his consort and his keenest advisor. Her sharp pragmatism, honed during the years of hardship, provided the necessary grounding to Simba's kingly vision. Their dynamic was one of mutual respect, forged not in the easy days of cubhood, but in the shared crucible of crisis. She was the silent witness to his growth, recognizing the mature sovereign who had finally stepped out of his father's shadow, while still honoring his memory. The joy that permeated the Pride Lands now was not the boisterous, carefree abandon of youth, but a deep, settled contentment, the relief of survivors who have navigated a devastating storm. Timon and Pumbaa, finding themselves suddenly courted by the establishment, navigated their new roles with characteristic absurdity. They were given a place of honor, their presence a constant, humorous reminder that even the most rigid social structures needed room for unconventional friendship. Timon, ever the opportunist, likely tried to establish a Hakuna Matata annex near the waterhole, only to be gently rebuffed by the ecological necessities of the restored environment. Pumbaa, whose inherent kindness made him universally adored, settled into a role as the kingdom's resident emotional barometer, his simple happiness radiating outward. Rafiki, having witnessed the full circle, the rise, the fall, and the redemption, began to withdraw slightly, his work complete. He was the living archive, the keeper of the transition, observing from a distance as the new generation cemented their reign. His parting glances toward Simba were tinged with the satisfaction of a mentor seeing a difficult, high-stakes project finally succeed. The concluding image is not of a grand coronation, but of the first true dawn washing over a revitalized Pride Lands. The harsh, unforgiving yellow of drought has been replaced by deep, verdant greens, and the air is filled with the sound of abundant life. Simba looks out, not with the triumphant swagger of a conqueror, but with the solemn responsibility of a custodian. He has not just inherited a throne, he has inherited a duty, proven himself worthy through personal anguish, and in doing so has ensured that the legacy of Mufasa will endure, not as a set of rules carved in stone, but as a living, breathing commitment to the continuous, delicate miracle of life. The return of the life-giving rain served as a profound emotional punctuation mark on the entire saga. It was the physical manifestation of forgiveness and perseverance. Simba, standing beside Nala, felt the cool moisture on his fur, an almost sacramental cleansing after years of arid guilt. His newfound authority wasn't based on divine right alone, but on demonstrable sacrifice and hard-won empathy. The deep lines of responsibility etched around his eyes spoke more eloquently of his kingship than any crown could. He was a monarch forged in the wilderness, understanding scarcity intimately, which made his stewardship inherently compassionate. Nala's role during this reconstruction phase was crucial, embodying the resilient spirit of the Pride Lands matriarchy. She was the pragmatic anchor, ensuring that the fervor of celebration did not override the necessary logistical work of rebuilding herds and securing safe territories. Her gaze, once sharp with desperation, now held the serene focus of someone who had fought hard for peace and intended to defend it through diligence. She complemented Simba's more visionary approach with an unyielding realism, a necessary counterpoint born from her struggle while he was in self-imposed exile. Timon and Pumbaa's integration into the royal court was handled with a surprising degree of gentle formality, largely facilitated by Pumbaa's innate decency and Timon's inability to resist a good audience. They became mascots of unity, living proof that the circle of life, while structured, was not entirely inflexible concerning friendship. Timon likely attempted to negotiate exclusive catering rights for the royal feasts, his entrepreneurial spirit unquenchable, while Pumbaa probably offered quiet emotional support to the overwhelmed lionesses, training the new generation of cubs. Their tenure underscored the theme that acceptance, not rigid adherence to tradition, was the true mark of a wise reign. Rafiki, the wandering philosopher, began his slow, deliberate retreat from the immediate center of courtly life. His work, as he often mused, was to plant the seeds of understanding, not to sit in the shade of the resulting canopy. He watched Simba teach his own progeny, the next wave, not with the stern didacticism Mufasa sometimes employed, but with a gentler, more experiential encouragement, drawing lessons from the stark visual reminders of the drought-stricken land still visible in the distance. Rafiki saw in Simba a synthesis. The majestic vision of Mufasa married to the hard-earned humility of exile. The final tableau, as the sun truly ascended over a flourishing pride rock, was a quiet testament to endurance. Simba, casting a long, strong shadow across the vibrant savanna, was no longer defined by the ghosts of the past, but by the tangible hope of the future. The roar he unleashed was not a challenge, but an affirmation. A sound that echoed not just across the plains, but through the very fabric of time, signaling that the heir had fully become the king, having passed through fire and emerged the true protector of the delicate, interconnected world his father envisioned. The burgeoning life across the Pride Lands carried the quiet resonance of a long-held prayer answered. Simba, now visibly heavier with the mantle of leadership, carried himself with a deliberate, grounded gait. The early mornings saw him not sequestered in a den, but walking the borders with the lionesses, his participation in the hunt, a symbolic reassurance that the ruling class shared in the effort, a crucial lesson absorbed from Mufasa's own committed example. There was a profound, almost palpable sense of relief emanating from the herds, a tentative trust beginning to bloom where fear had long reigned supreme. Nala's influence was subtly yet powerfully woven into the fabric of the restored kingdom. She often directed the practicalities of resource management, her focus sharp on sustainability, a direct response to the scarcity she had personally endured. There was a deep, unspoken understanding between her and Simba. They were partners who had navigated separate, agonizing paths only to converge at the apex of shared responsibility. Her patience, tested by famine, was now a source of steady governance, tempering any impulse Simba might have toward purely symbolic gestures. Timon and Pumbaa settled into their unofficial roles as the court's necessary anomaly. Timon, the silver-tongued showman, likely found ways to monetize his new status, perhaps starting an overly ambitious composting initiative or lobbying for preferential insect-gathering zones, his energy undiminished by royal proximity. Pumbaa remained the emotional ballast, his gentle nature serving as a soothing presence during council meetings where ancient rivalries occasionally flared. Their presence was a living anecdote, a reminder that loyalty, even when expressed through an absurd philosophy, held inherent value. Rafiki's departure was marked by a ceremonial yet understated farewell. The ancient mandrill offered Simba a final cryptic proverb, perhaps related to the necessity of shedding old skins, before turning his focus back to the wider rhythms of the African continent. He left behind not just memories, but a palpable sense of ecological stewardship, having been successfully transferred to a new, capable generation. His was the legacy of the insightful observer who understands that true change must be enacted by those standing in the sunlight. The closing scenes are suffused with a warm, golden light, indicating not just good weather, but the inner peace achieved by the king. Simba, watching a new cub tentatively explore the crest of Pride Rock, perhaps his own, under the watchful eye of Nala, understood the full weight of the circle of life. It wasn't a simple hierarchy, it was a continuous negotiation between power and humility, a responsibility passed down through sacrifice. His roar, when it came, was deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of the arrogance that had characterized Scar's desperate reign. It was the sound of a king who had earned his place by embracing the very pain that sought to destroy him, finally standing fully realized in the light of his destiny. The generations that followed Simba's reign inherited a land rich not just in resources, but in wisdom distilled from near catastrophe. Simba himself became a living legend, his narrative a crucial element in the education of the next cohort of young lions. He avoided the pitfalls of his father, Mufasa, who, though wise, maintained a certain regal distance. Simba, having lived the life of an outcast, never forgot the hunger of the forgotten, and his reign was characterized by an inclusive stewardship. He ensured that the hyenas, even after their banishment, were monitored not with malice, but with a clear understanding of the volatile nature of unmanaged hunger, maintaining a healthy, if wary, boundary. Nala, the queen, became renowned for her foresight. She pushed for the establishment of sophisticated migratory routes that anticipated environmental shifts, moving beyond simple reactive management to proactive ecological planning. Her legacy was written in the sustained health of the grazing lands, a quiet, enduring triumph over the devastating short-sightedness of Scar's tenure. She was the silent strategist, her counsel sought by every senior lioness, revered for her ability to see 10 seasons ahead. The jungle duo, Timon and Pumbaa, transitioned into roles that bordered on royal eccentrics, yet their importance was undeniable. They were the living repository of the time before, the necessary counter-narrative to the formality of kingship. Timon likely became the self-appointed master of ceremonies for festivals, injecting well-timed, chaotic humor when the weight of tradition threatened to stifle necessary levity. Pumbaa, whose emotional honesty never wavered, became the unofficial confidant for any cub struggling with the intensity of royal expectation, his sheer, unadulterated goodness a constant source of equilibrium. Rafiki, observing from the periphery of the Pride Lands, occasionally sent cryptic messages carried by migrating birds, small tokens of encouragement or subtle warnings that only Simba and Nala could fully decipher. He represented the timelessness of their commitment. The circle of life was not a static decree but an ongoing conversation across generations. His final unobserved passage from the Pride Lands was not an ending, but a quiet transition into the great, unseen network of ancestral wisdom. The final image that settles over the Pride Lands is one of deep, cyclical stability. The landscape itself seems to breathe easier. Simba, now silver-maned and bearing the dignified wear of decades of devoted rule, surveys a kingdom vibrant with life. He has successfully brokered the most difficult contract in leadership, ensuring that the memory of failure serves as the bedrock for enduring success. The story concludes not with a single event, but with the gentle, persistent hum of a balanced world, continuing its slow, magnificent turning under the watch of a king who truly understood that to lead is to serve the ground beneath one's feet. The enduring legacy Simba forged was rooted in a profound understanding of cyclical renewal, a concept he learned not from Mufasa's eloquent pronouncements, but from the raw, stinging memory of his own abandonment. He cultivated an atmosphere of continuous learning, ensuring that the lionesses, under Nala's pragmatic direction, maintained vigilance not just over territorial threats but over subtle environmental shifts. Simba's interactions with the Pride were notably tactile. He would often rest his heavy frame near the younger members, offering not just stern guidance, but the tangible comfort of a king who had once been utterly lost. This blend of royal authority and genuine empathy became the hallmark of his reign, setting a precedent that elevated stewardship above mere domination. Nala's strategic mind proved indispensable in establishing long-term ecological resilience. She championed conservation efforts long before the term existed, recognizing the finite nature of the savanna's bounty. Her persistence led to the conscious diversification of the hunting grounds, ensuring that no single resource was ever overtaxed, a direct corrective to the predatory monoculture Scar had imposed. When she looked at Simba, it was with the clear, unwavering vision of a battle-tested comrade. Their shared history of loss meant their partnership was less about romance and more about the flawless execution of their shared purpose. Timon and Pumbaa's continued presence was a delicate balancing act, a necessary touch of the absurd in the face of solemn responsibility. Timon, likely attempting to unionize the various insect populations for better working conditions, brought an element of organized chaos that prevented complacency. Pumbaa, the embodiment of uncritical acceptance, served as an unofficial ambassador to the fringes of the Pride Lands, his very presence a testament to the kingdom's capacity for forgiveness. They were the living illustration that true societal strength lies in embracing difference, not erasing it. Rafiki, having fulfilled his role as the kingdom's metaphysical repairman, faded into the deeper, more remote regions, his wisdom echoing faintly through the wilderness. He was the spirit of necessary change, understanding that his greatest contribution was stepping away when the pupils had become capable of leading themselves. His influence remained not as direct guidance, but as the quiet background hum of cosmic alignment that Simba instinctively tuned into. As Simba surveyed his domain in his elder years, the pride was a testament to corrected history. The cubs born under his rule knew of Scar only as a cautionary tale, a dark, ill-advised period that proved the tenacity of nature's true order. Simba himself, his mane a mix of silver and gold, stood as the embodiment of earned kingship, a leader whose deepest strength was derived from confronting his greatest weakness. The final enduring image is of the unbroken horizon, a landscape secured not by magic or birthright alone, but by the hard-won maturity of a king who finally understood that the circle of life demands constant, loving attention. The twilight years of Simba's reign were characterized by a profound sense of completion, a quiet satisfaction that permeated the very soil of the Pride Lands. His appearance had shifted from the fiery vigor of the young king to the weighty majesty of the elder statesman. The silver threading through his dark mane was not a sign of waning power, but a visual chronicle of the seasons he had successfully navigated. He often spent his afternoons not in grand pronouncements, but in silent contemplation atop Pride Rock, observing the complex, self-regulating rhythm of the restored kingdom. This was the tranquility born of effort. The silence after the storm has finally passed its peak. Nala, equally aged, possessed a regal composure that was perhaps even more commanding than Simba's own. She had successfully curated an environment where competence was valued over mere lineage. Her counsel to Simba in these later years was often focused on succession planning, ensuring that the younger lions grasped the nuanced responsibility of leadership, that it was not merely about maintaining order, but fostering continuous, thoughtful evolution. Her eyes, which had seen the worst of famine, held a steadfast optimism, knowing that the lessons learned during hardship were now embedded in the kingdom's DNA. Their companionship was a silent dialogue of mutual respect, two monarchs who had shared the deepest vulnerability and emerged into shared, unbreakable strength. Timon and Pumbaa, now cherished, ancient figures, provided the necessary historical continuity. Timon, perhaps having finally mastered a modest investment strategy based on rare grubs, remained sharp-witted, his commentary softening from sardonic to affectionately teasing. Pumbaa, whose heart remained eternally open, often presided over the welcoming ceremonies for newborn cubs, his booming, joyful snorts serving as the kingdom's most sincere applause. They were living monuments to the fact that kinship transcends species and philosophy. They were the tangible evidence that the circle of life, in its truest interpretation, embraced even the most unconventional members. Rafiki's memory remained a potent, if distant, force. The stories told to the youngest cubs often revolved around the wise mandrill, positioning him as the catalyst who brought the wandering prince back to his true purpose. He was the archetype of the necessary departure, True mentorship culminates in self-sufficiency for the student. Simba never sought to replace Rafiki's spiritual guidance, understanding that some connections must remain ethereal, rooted in the unseen architecture of the world. The final piece that settled over the Pride Lands was perhaps the most beautiful performance of Simba's life. There was no single dramatic moment of death or coronation, but a slow, graceful blending back into the cycle he had so fiercely protected. He passed the mantle not with a flourish, but with a deep, shared breath alongside Nala, ensuring that the foundation of empathetic, sustainable leadership was unshakable. The enduring image is of a vast, sun-drenched vista teeming with healthy life, a landscape where the lessons etched in suffering have finally blossomed into enduring, fertile peace. The legacy was secure. The king who ran away had returned to become the king who stayed, defined by his stewardship until the very end. The inheritance passed to the next generation was a kingdom profoundly shaped by the emotional and ecological scars of the past. Simba and Nala ensured that their successors understood that kingship was an ongoing act of reparations to the land itself. The lessons gleaned from the drought were institutionalized. Meticulous record-keeping of rainfall patterns and herd movements became as vital to the royal duties as leading the morning hunts. The young heir, perhaps a daughter inheriting the keen strategic mind of Nala, was taught early to value observation above assertion, a direct antidote to Scar's impulsive arrogance. The very topography of the Pride Lands, with its healed scars and new growth, served as a living textbook on consequence and redemption. Nala, in her final years as Queen Mother, solidified her reputation as the keeper of practical truth. She seldom spoke of Scar, preferring to emphasize the virtue of diligent, unglamorous work. Her interactions with the Pride Lionesses were defined by quiet, shared labor, reinforcing the idea that royalty was defined by service, not privilege. She ensured the historical narrative emphasized Mufasa's wisdom and Simba's arduous journey back, consciously downplaying the dramatic flash of heroism in favor of enduring commitment. Her influence guaranteed that the foundational ethics of the reign, responsibility, empathy, and foresight, would remain deeply rooted, resistant to the superficial allure of absolute power. Timon and Pumbaa, by this point, were legendary figures, their stories woven into the cautionary and celebratory tales told around the evening fires. Timon, perhaps having briefly managed to introduce a complex, albeit ultimately failed, system of bartering based on rare beetles, served as the perpetual reminder against overcomplication. Pumbaa, whose longevity was a marvel, was the kingdom's living embodiment of unconditional acceptance. He was frequently found near the cubs, his massive, warm body offering an impenetrable sanctuary, his mere presence a testament to the stability of the realm, a stability purchased by Simba's difficult return. They were the tolerated chaos, the proof that the circle was wide enough for those who simply chose loyalty. Rafiki's absence was finally felt not as a loss, but as an integration. The wisdom he represented had diffused into the atmosphere, becoming instinctual in the way the lions perceived their world. The occasional sighting of a mysterious mandrill, far off in the distant territories, was less an omen and more a blessing. A nod from the ancient, knowing world to the successful continuation of the delicate balance on the ground. The spiritual guidance had transitioned into cultural habit. Simba himself, now bearing the weight of a full, successful reign, found a profound quietude. He had successfully closed the circle his father began, not by mimicking Mufasa's grandeur, but by internalizing his lessons through personal torment. He looked upon the vast, flourishing kingdom and recognized that the greatest victory was not defeating the villain, but cultivating a world where such villainy could no longer take root. His final departure, unrecorded by fanfare, was a quiet merging back into the ecosystem he had fiercely guarded, a final act of service, ensuring that the sun would rise again over a truly secure Pride Lands, the legacy no longer tied to a single king, but woven into the very essence of the land itself. The passing of Simba marked not an end, but the smooth transition to the next epoch of the Pride Lands' enduring narrative. His final moments were spent in quiet communion with Nala, under the canopy of an ancient acacia, their shared silence speaking volumes of a lifetime navigating triumph and near ruin. Simba's final lessons to his successor emphasized the ephemeral nature of power, urging them to remain ever vigilant against the temptation of isolation, the very trap that had nearly consumed him. He left behind a dynasty defined by lived experience rather than inherited dogma, a crucial distinction. Nala, now the undisputed matriarch of wisdom, steered the young ruler through the immediate complexities of succession. Her administrative legacy was one of meticulous preservation. She oversaw the cataloging of ecological data collected over decades, ensuring that every decision regarding water rights or migratory paths was informed by historical precedent and scientific observation, a hard-won habit born from the starvation years. Her demeanor remained one of dignified reserve, yet beneath the composure pulsed the fierce, protective love of a survivor who had witnessed true devastation. She was the embodiment of resilient governance, her reign by Simba's side a masterclass in complementary leadership. Timon and Pumbaa, having outlived nearly every contemporary save Rafiki's legend, became revered relics. Their jungle clearing, now safely bordered by patrolling lionesses, was treated as a historical site, a testament to the unlikely alliances that saved a kingdom. Timon, perhaps finally understanding the gravity of stability, became the kingdom's unofficial historian of levity, ensuring that even the most solemn pronouncements were occasionally punctuated by absurd anecdotes from the Hakuna Matata years, a psychological release valve for the populace. Pumbaa, content simply to bask in the continued peace, served as the touchstone for pure, uncomplicated joy, reminding everyone that life's simple pleasures were the ultimate prize of peace. Rafiki's spiritual influence, though physically absent, was perceived in the very air, a subtle, constant calibration. The new generation of shamans and spiritual guides consciously referenced his teachings, understanding that the connection to the ancestors was not about demanding intervention, but about listening to the deep currents of the natural world. His was the silent blessing upon a realm where the spiritual and the physical were once again perceived as seamlessly interwoven. The final lingering image is of the Pride Lands, thriving under the governance of a king who knew the taste of ash and chose instead to cultivate roses. Simba's ultimate achievement was transforming personal tragedy into universal stability. The new generation inherited not a gilded cage, but an open vista of responsibility, one secured by the difficult, necessary journey of an exiled cub who dared to reclaim his shadow, integrate it, and ultimately step into the eternal, sustaining light of his destiny. The era following Simba's gentle passing ushered in a period of almost utopian equilibrium, yet it was a quiet equilibrium, devoid of the dramatic arcs that had defined the previous generation. The new ruler, inheriting the throne, possessed the inherent grace of royalty mixed with the grounding humility learned through osmosis from Nala's steadfast pragmatism. There was no need for fiery redemption arcs. The path was already illuminated, the dangers catalogued. This reign was characterized by maintenance, the nuanced, often thankless work of keeping a delicate machine perfectly tuned. Nala, now the venerated Queen Mother, became the living embodiment of institutional memory. Her counsel was delivered with the weight of historical record, often referencing specific ecological failures under Scar and the harrowing lessons learned during Simba's absence. She was the guardian against recidivism, her quiet scrutiny ensuring that no single individual, not even the king, became too detached from the realities of the savannah floor. Her greatest pride lay in the fact that the lions now instinctively understood sustainable hunting quotas without needing a royal decree. It was simply known. Her emotional landscape was one of deep, satisfied contentment, the hard-won piece of a strategist whose long-term plans had finally borne fruit across generations. Timon and Pumbaa were elevated beyond mere court figures. They were the living mythology of the kingdom's improbable survival. Timon, embracing his role as the court jester-philosopher, likely established an oral tradition of highly exaggerated storytelling, using his flair for the dramatic to illustrate the danger of tunnel vision. Pumbaa, whose gentle presence was irreplaceable, became the final, undisputed arbiter of character among the pride's youth. A cub who could earn a rumbling approval from Pumbaa was instantly deemed trustworthy, his simple, vast emotional capacity functioning as an unerring moral compass. Their existence was a constant, subtle rebuke to any rising elitism, a necessary grounding in the absurd truth that all life is interconnected, even the unlikely friendships forged in the darkest jungle. Rafiki's legend solidified into a pervasive cultural energy, rather than a tangible presence. The mandrill was no longer perceived as a mystic who needed to be sought out, but as the essential spirit of the Pride Lands, the understanding that true wisdom flows from recognizing the interconnectedness of birth, death, and rebirth. When the new cubs were presented on Pride Rock, the ancestral connection was affirmed not through a direct message, but through the inherent feeling of rightness, the environmental harmony itself speaking the benediction. The final perspective offered is one of profound, sustainable continuity. Simba's great work was not simply reclaiming the throne, but engineering a culture robust enough to endure long after his own life force returned to the earth. The savannah under the new reign is characterized by a mature vibrancy. The colors are deep, the air is clean, and the roars echo with confidence, but never with challenge. The ultimate triumph is the absence of high drama, the quiet, relentless assurance that the circle of life is not a battle to be won once, but a daily commitment to nurture, a commitment so deeply ingrained that the very possibility of another scar seems, at last, an impossibility. The 2019 iteration of The Lion King, directed by Jon Favreau, presents a fascinating case study in the tension between technological ambition and narrative resonance. Stripping away the stylized, expressionistic animation of the 1994 original, this photorealistic rendering attempts to ground the mythic journey of Simba in tangible, almost documentary-like visuals. The result is an aesthetic marvel, leveraging the advancements in digital cinematography that Favreau himself championed in The Jungle Book, but one that occasionally sacrifices emotional immediacy for sheer spectacle. The central performance challenge rests on Donald Glover as the voice of Simba. Glover, an artist whose career trajectory spans critically acclaimed television Atlanta to Grammy-winning music, Childish Gambino, brings a naturalistic, somewhat hesitant gravitas to the young prince. His musical contributions, particularly the reinterpretation of "Can You Feel the Love Tonight," reflect his modern sensibility, yet the sheer weight of James Earl Jones's legacy as Mufasa's voice provides an almost insurmountable bar for the emotional core of the film. Jones's return is perhaps the most successful integration of past and present. His booming presence anchors the film in the familiar grandeur of the Pride Lands, evoking the Shakespearean tragedy that underpinned the original narrative. The visual fidelity, while breathtaking in its depiction of the African savanna, the dust motes catching the light, the vastness of the herds, ironically becomes a limiting factor in character expression. Animals in nature communicate through subtle shifts in posture and vocalization. Their faces, designed for realism, lack the exaggerated, emotive architecture that allowed the hand-drawn characters to telegraph complex emotions like fear, despair, or exhilaration instantaneously. When Scar, voiced by Chiwetel Ejiofor, expresses his jealousy, the audience must rely almost entirely on Ejiofor's nuanced delivery, as the photorealistic lion face resists the necessary, almost cartoonish, scowl of betrayal. Ejiofor's Scar is a study in controlled resentment, a departure from Jeremy Irons' more flamboyant, melodramatic villainy. This Scar feels more like a neglected intellectual forced into exile, channeling his bitterness into calculated manipulation rather than theatrical malice. This shift aligns with a broader trend in recent Disney remakes, grounding the fantastical elements in a semblance of naturalism, even when the plot demands talking lions. The introduction of Timon and Pumbaa, voiced by Billy Eichner and Seth Rogen respectively, serves as the necessary tonal break. Eichner and Rogen inject a crucial, chaotic energy that the relentless realism often suppresses. Their comedic timing, honed through years in improvisational and character-driven comedy, cuts through the CGI sheen. Their segment, Hakuna Matata, provides the film with its necessary pulse of escapism, allowing the audience a reprieve from the oppressive beauty of the meticulously rendered environment. However, the philosophical core of the film, the circle of life, is where the visual approach struggles most significantly against the story's inherent spirituality. The original film used vibrant color palettes and stylized sequences to visualize the interconnectedness of the ecosystem and the spiritual presence of the ancestors. Here, the visual translation of ancestral guidance, Mufasa appearing in the clouds, feels like an impressive technical effect rather than a transcendent moment of spiritual awakening. The awe is technical, perhaps, but the emotional leap required for Simba's acceptance of responsibility feels less earned because the world itself appears too much like the world we already know. Ultimately, The Lion King, 2019, stands as a testament to technological prowess, a painstaking recreation that proves digital tools can perfectly mimic reality. Yet, in achieving near-perfect realism, it inadvertently highlights what the original animation possessed: the freedom to abstract reality to serve the emotional, mythic truth of its narrative. It is a beautiful, functional piece of cinema, meticulously crafted, but one that lacks the untamed, beating heart of its predecessor. The sheer dedication to verisimilitude forces the audience to continually reconcile what they are seeing, a documentary about large African mammals, with what they are hearing, a complex Shakespearean tragedy transposed onto the savannah. This cognitive dissonance is perhaps the film's most defining characteristic. When Nala, voiced by Beyonce Knowles Carter, pleads with Simba to return, the urgency in her voice, amplified by Knowles Carter's powerful but restrained delivery, struggles to fully manifest on her face. Her eyes, though perfectly rendered spheres reflecting the light, cannot convey the depth of desperation that a simple, wide, pleading cartoon eye could have instantly communicated. This is the eternal quandary of photorealism in anthropomorphic storytelling. Realism demands stoicism, where drama demands overt expression. The role of Rafiki, voiced by John Kani, also shifts subtly within this new paradigm. Kani, a celebrated South African actor known for his profound theatrical presence, approaches the shamanistic mandrill with a quiet, grounded wisdom. His movements are deliberate, rooted in observable primate behavior, which lends an air of authentic ritual to the finding of Simba in the jungle. Yet, the famous scene where he paints Simba's markings feels less like a mystical anointing and more like a necessary biological grooming session, robbing the moment of some of its necessary, almost surreal, magic. The shamanic connection to the past becomes observational rather than revelatory. Scar's ultimate defeat, too, feels diminished by the commitment to naturalistic violence. The original film offered a dramatic, almost balletic confrontation between lion and lion, amplified by sharp angles and heightened sound design. Here, the fight is brutal, messy, and fast, adhering to the perceived reality of a struggle for dominance. While impactful, this grounded violence doesn't carry the same operatic weight as the stylized struggle for the throne, where every claw swipe carried narrative destiny. The focus shifts from symbolic justice to survival expediency. Furthermore, the sheer scope of the visual environment, while stunning, often swallows the characters whole. When the stampede occurs, the overwhelming scale of panicked wildebeest is undeniable, a masterful demonstration of digital particle simulation. However, in the midst of this visual chaos, Simba's terror, though audible in Glover's strained cries, feels spatially distant. The camera often pulls back to capture the entirety of the spectacle, implicitly prioritizing the landscape over the plight of the central figure, a decision antithetical to the original's tight framing on the young cub's vulnerability. This landscape becomes both the breathtaking setting and the primary character, occasionally relegating the drama to a secondary concern. The 2019 version is undeniably beautiful, a technical triumph showcasing the potential of game engine cinema, but it constantly reminds the viewer that they are observing a simulation, which perhaps paradoxically makes it harder to fully believe in the myth being told. The film's ambitious fidelity to nature inadvertently highlights the artificiality required for true myth-making, where the 1994 animation used a painterly wash to convey the oppressive heat of the dry season or the explosive vitality of the rains. Favreau's version relies on literal depiction. The heat is visual dryness, the rain is literal droplets, which, while technically flawless, lacks the emotive shorthand animation provides. This distinction becomes crucial when considering the film's exploration of exile and return. Simba's adult years under the care of Timon and Pumbaa, a sequence built on the charisma of Eichner and Rogen's comedic rapport, serves as a necessary period of emotional stasis. They provide a hedonistic but ultimately shallow alternative to the responsibilities of kingship. Glover's vocalization during this phase emphasizes a detached resignation. The weight of his past, the guilt over Mufasa's death, is channeled into a sort of laid-back apathy, perfectly fitting the carefree philosophy they espouse. Yet, the transition from this comfortable inertia back to the arduous path of reckoning feels abrupt. The catalyst for change, Nala's appearance, while visually impressive as she bursts into the jungle oasis, relies heavily on Knowles Carter's vocal command to convey the urgency of a dying world, a world Simba has willfully ignored. The dynamic between the hyenas, Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed in the original, consolidated here into a trio led by Florence Kasumba's Shenzi, also suffers under the realism constraint. The original hyenas were grotesque, their exaggerated features mirroring their low social standing and desperate cruelty. Kasumba's Shenzi is presented as a more pragmatic, survivalist predator operating within the established ecosystem, albeit one bent to Scar's will. This grounded portrayal reduces some of the theatrical menace. Their actions feel less like the chaotic forces of disruption and more like an unfortunate, albeit violent, natural consequence of Scar's bad management. The film struggles to portray them as truly irredeemable villains when they are visually consistent with the other large carnivores populating the savanna. The climax, Simba's confrontation with Scar, while visually kinetic, suffers from the emotional flattening previously noted. When Scar attempts to use the spectral suggestion of Mufasa to control Simba, the moment lacks the soaring, accusatory drama of the original. The visual effects team successfully rendered the dramatic lighting shift, suggesting Mufasa's presence in the sky, but without the exaggerated emotional topography on the characters' faces, the wide, accusing eyes of the past, the confrontation remains largely an exchange of exposition delivered under harsh lighting. Simba's final rejection of Scar's manipulation relies almost entirely on Glover finally finding the necessary fire in his voice, signifying his acceptance of the mantle rather than a visible, visceral transformation, reflecting the weight of his lineage finally settling upon him. This 2019 iteration remains a monumental achievement in rendering a recognizable world, but in doing so, it sometimes renders the legendary journey merely plausible rather than undeniably mythic. The very choice to employ Favreau's technological template, honed to near perfection in his adaptation of Kipling's work, suggests an inherent tension in approaching a story like The Lion King, which is fundamentally an allegory about destiny and spiritual inheritance. The Jungle Book benefited from the inherent wildness of its source material. The jungle allows for greater visual license under the guise of naturalism. The Pride Lands, however, are defined by the social order, the circle of life, a structure that demands visual articulation of hierarchy and spiritual connection beyond mere biological fact. This leads to an examination of the musical integration, which arguably faces the most significant hurdles in the transition to realism. While Elton John and Tim Rice's iconic score remains, the performance context alters its impact profoundly. In the 1994 film, the songs were fully integrated moments of theatrical release. The characters broke the fourth wall of realism to convey overwhelming emotion. Here, the musical numbers often feel like elaborate, if beautifully shot, interludes that the photorealistic animals reluctantly perform. When the ensemble sings of the circle of life, the sheer number of realistically rendered animals creates a majestic tableau, a living ecosystem demonstration, but the collective feeling rarely transcends impressive CGI rendering. It becomes a demonstration of technical achievement, how many perfectly textured digital gazelles can populate the frame, rather than a unified expression of belief. The film's pacing also reflects the necessary adjustments made for the visual style. The need to establish the sheer scale and environment occasionally drags the early narrative. The original film moved with an almost breathless pace through the exposition, prioritizing the emotional beats that set up Mufasa's eventual fall. Here, the extended sequences dedicated to the natural beauty, the sunrise over Pride Rock, the slow tracking shots across the plains, while aesthetically pleasing, dilute the immediacy of the rising political tension within the den. Scar's machinations often feel like necessary plot points slotted between moments of visual splendor, rather than organic poison seeping into the body politic. The film achieves visual grandeur at the expense of dramatic velocity. Furthermore, the use of sound design, though meticulous in replicating natural ambient noise, the specific calls of birds, the rustle of dry grass, sometimes drowns out the crucial intimacy required for father-son bonding. Mufasa's counsel to Simba in the stars, meant to be a moment of profound, hushed connection across realms, is often underscored by the ambient soundscape of the night, demanding the audience lean in to catch the dialogue, rather than being emotionally pulled in by the sheer force of Mufasa's moral authority. The commitment to realism requires an adherence to acoustic truth, but myth requires selective deafness, amplifying the essential over the incidental. The 2019 Lion King is a painstaking translation, demonstrating that sometimes the most profound truths are best conveyed not through what the eye can see, but through the deliberate, expressive exaggeration of what the eye cannot see. The very commitment to documentary-style observation subtly undermines the film's central thesis regarding leadership and intrinsic worth. Mufasa's authority, which in the animated version was conveyed through his upright, almost kingly posture and expansive physical presence, here rests more heavily on the gravitas provided by James Earl Jones's voice and the sheer size of the photorealistic lion. When Simba finally claims his place atop Pride Rock at the film's conclusion, the shot is undeniably monumental, capturing the dawn breaking over a restored kingdom. However, the visceral feeling of earned kingship, the recognition of a true leader by his subjects, is softened by the ambiguity of the crowd reaction. The herds, rendered with such meticulous detail, look less like an adoring populace acknowledging their rightful ruler and more like a large gathering of animals that are simply present. There is a disconnect between the narrative's insistence on Simba's inherent destiny and the visual evidence which suggests he has merely outlasted his usurper. This issue of earned emotion is particularly acute in the visual representation of the Pride Lands under Scar's rule. The original depicted environmental degradation through a distinct visual language, the colors becoming desaturated, the environment looking withered and exhausted. Here, the change is primarily conveyed through the diminished size of the remaining prey animals and the general lack of lushness. While technically accurate to a prolonged drought, it lacks the symbolic punch of a kingdom actively being poisoned by a malevolent king. Scar's reign feels more like poor governance resulting in scarcity than a metaphysical blight on the land itself. Chiwetel Ejiofor's performance captures the anxiety of a ruler ill-equipped to manage resources, but the landscape itself does not scream in protest with the same visual fervor as before. The bond between Simba and Nala, crucial for driving the plot toward Simba's return, is similarly constrained. Beyonce Knowles-Carter imbues Nala with a mature, persuasive urgency, signaling her transformation from a playful peer to a partner fighting for survival. Yet their interactions in the jungle, particularly their brief, stylized fight that morphs into adult affection, feel awkwardly paced. The photorealistic rendering struggles to capture the necessary fluid choreography of both combat and burgeoning romance. A quick, realistic tussle between two lions, meant to convey deep familiarity and underlying attraction, reads instead as a tense, brief display of dominance typical of the species, missing the humanized, romantic subtext essential for driving Simba back to his duties. The film attempts to bridge the gap between animal behavior and human emotion, but often the animal behavior wins out, leaving the romance feeling intellectually understood but emotionally remote. In its pursuit of technical perfection, the 2019 vision often settles for illustrating the story rather than embodying its mythic heart. The lingering effect of this photorealistic aesthetic is a sense of detachment from the primal urges that motivate the narrative's key players. Take, for instance, the characterization of Zazu, voiced by John Oliver. Oliver brings a distinctly exasperated, bureaucratic energy to the majordomo, perfectly capturing the stressed-out civil servant perpetually cleaning up the messes of the royal family. In the 1994 version, Zazu's bright, almost rigid appearance matched his fastidious nature. Here, his movements are dictated by the limitations of avian reality. He is a hornbill, constrained by genuine ornithological physics. This results in his panicked flight sequences and desperate appeals to Scar feeling less like the frantic performance of a loyal advisor and more like the predictable, panicked movements of a bird caught in a dangerous situation. His intellectual exasperation is undercut by the visual necessity of him simply being a small, relatively vulnerable creature in a world of very large, very realistic predators. The philosophical emptiness felt when confronting the circle of life extends powerfully into the presentation of the hyena's initial introduction. In the original, the shadowy, cramped, and almost gothic aesthetic of the elephant graveyard served as a visual manifestation of Scar's moral corruption. It was a place explicitly defined by its unnaturalness and danger within the savanna's balance. Favreau's approach demands that the graveyard simply look like a harsh, desolate part of the land. While desolate, it lacks the necessary sinister quality. The hyenas emerge not from the darkness of corruption, but from the harsh reality of resource scarcity. This visual normalization dilutes the sense that Scar has invited a truly chaotic, morally bankrupt element into the kingdom. Their villainy becomes a function of poor management under the new regime, rather than an intrinsic ideological opposition to Mufasa's reign, a crucial distinction for an allegory about good and evil. The emotional crux of Simba's tragedy, the vision of Mufasa after the stampede, is perhaps the most telling moment where the pursuit of realism actively hinders narrative impact. In the original, the shock was visceral, driven by the stark contrast between the young cub's overwhelming grief and the sudden, impossible spiritual visitation. Here, the sequence is bathed in the unsettling, beautiful light that Favreau masters, but Simba's reaction feels contained. Donald Glover's vocal performance conveys terror and sorrow, but the camera is often fixed on rendering the realistic texture of Simba's mane and the atmospheric haze. The emotional geography of the moment is flattened because the spectacle is primarily one of impressive rendering technology rather than devastating, soul-shattering spiritual contact. The viewer appreciates the lighting effects more than they feel the weight of the spectral accusation. This film, for all its technical brilliance, consistently prioritizes the beautiful surface over the agonizing depth required to sustain a story of this magnitude. It is a triumph of craft, but a case study in the inherent narrative limitations of hyperrealism when applied to myth. The challenge faced by the voice actors, despite their considerable talents, is how to inject dramatic weight into characters whose physical manifestations are deliberately constrained by the laws of observed nature. This is acutely felt in the depiction of the circle of life's recurring motif, the reverence for the fallen. When Mufasa's spirit appears to Simba, the ethereal projection in the clouds, while technically flawless in its integration with the sky texture, lacks the necessary visual elevation to truly signify divine intervention. It exists as an impressive atmospheric effect, a dramatic weather pattern, rather than a direct, impossibly moving connection to the ancestral realm. The inherent magic of the original film resided in its willingness to defy visual logic in service of emotional truth. This version insists on logical consistency, thereby sidelining the miraculous. The comedic duo of Timon and Pumbaa, while vibrant due to the infectious chemistry between Billy Eichner and Seth Rogen, often highlights the visual inconsistency most sharply. Their exaggerated reactions and vocal inflections, classic broad comedic timing, feel like intruders in the meticulously crafted natural world. When Pumbaa loudly farts or Timon delivers a sharp, human-centric piece of irony, the realism of the surrounding environment momentarily shatters. This is not a flaw in their performance, but a necessary consequence of the source material's duality. They represent the necessary human element, the modern, self-aware perspective, that the photorealistic animals cannot organically embody. Their segments function as necessary safety valves, allowing the audience to laugh at the sheer absurdity of watching talking, philosophy-spouting animals, thus temporarily forgiving the film for asking them to ignore the visual evidence of their own species. Furthermore, the narrative pacing in the film's final act, centered on the return to Pride Rock, seems to compress the necessary emotional development for Simba's acceptance of his role. In the original, the build-up to the final confrontation was laced with Simba's internal struggle juxtaposed against the kingdom's visible suffering. Here, the transition from the comfortable apathy of Hakuna Matata to the decisive battle feels too rapid. Nala's re-entry into Simba's life serves primarily as a plot mechanism rather than a deep emotional catalyst. Their reunion is rushed, visually beautiful but narratively underweight. The film seems desperate to get to the climactic battle, perhaps sensing that the quiet moments of emotional reckoning are where its photorealistic shell is weakest, unable to convincingly contain the weight of destiny. The visual spectacle of the final fight, the rain lashing down, and the primal roar for kingship are impressive feats of digital choreography, yet they conclude a journey that feels more thoroughly shown than deeply felt. The final image is one of stunning photographic beauty, a perfect depiction of a lion on a rock, but the mythic reverberation of the restored order feels muted, an artifact of an impressive technical exercise rather than a soul-stirring return to the sacred balance. The very foundation of the Pride lands, the majestic Pride Rock itself, suffers under this relentless push for photorealism. In the 1994 animation, Pride Rock was a character, sharp, towering, almost deliberately artificial in its grandeur, serving as a throne and a sacred altar simultaneously. It was built for drama. In the 2019 version, it is rendered with geological accuracy, a believable promontory atop a vast plain. While undeniably beautiful as a natural landmark, its symbolic power is diminished. It becomes a high vantage point for a gathering rather than the immutable seat of divine right. When Simba ascends it, the audience registers the geography, not the spiritual elevation. This shift from symbolic architecture to accurate topography mirrors the film's overall struggle, celebrating the look of nature while neglecting the heightened reality required for fable. The tragedy of Mufasa's death, the pivot upon which Simba's entire existence hinges, is also functionally altered by the visual realism. Mufasa's fall into the gorge, meant to be a shocking, sharp amputation of Simba's world, is muted by the sheer scale of the stampede. The camera's fidelity to the chaos, the realistic scattering of hooves, the clouds of dust, fragments the focus. The horror is distributed across the massive visual field, making it difficult for the audience to lock onto the intimate horror of the cub watching his father perish. Donald Glover's strained cries are evident, but the visual noise competes directly with the emotional signal. The audience is forced to process the physics of the stampede before they can process the emotional devastation, a sequence where immediacy and clarity are sacrificed at the altar of environmental scope. Even the final confrontation between Simba and Scar, stripped of its theatrical flourishes, reveals the constraints on character motivation when rendered realistically. Scar's moment of confession, where he reveals the truth about Mufasa's death, loses its accusatory sting because his face, a realistic lion muzzle, cannot contort into the exaggerated expressions of panic and guilt that would typically accompany such a confession in high drama. Ejiofor's voice sells the betrayal, but the visual evidence is restrained. He looks like a desperate lion trying to evade an attack, not a fallen king trapped by his own hubris. When Simba rejects him, the final expulsion onto the waiting hyenas feels more like animal culling than divine karmic justice. The narrative requires Scar's demise to feel like the cleansing of a moral rot. The visual language delivers it as a successful territorial dominance assertion by a stronger male. This technical choice ultimately prioritizes the plausible over the cathartic, leaving the audience with a sense of completion, but perhaps not the necessary, visceral sense of righteousness. The subtle yet profound impact of this realism extends even to the background characters, whose archetypal functions in the original story are somewhat obscured by the desire for biological consistency. The lionesses, Simba's tribe, are visually rendered as a cohesive, powerful unit, their coordination in the hunt, and their collective mourning palpable through their mass presence. However, the individual emotional journeys, the silent suffering of Sarabi, for instance, are harder to parse. Her grief, a vital counterpoint to Scar's tyranny, must be expressed through restrained, naturalistic gestures. While Jane Seymour's voice performance in the original animated her with palpable stoic anguish, here the collective weight of the lioness's silent suffering feels spread too thin across dozens of identical, perfect digital faces, diluting the focus on the matriarch's direct response to the usurper. This general flattening of individual emotional contours means that the thematic weight of responsibility falls almost entirely onto the vocal delivery of the lead actors, creating a reliance on auditory performance that overshadows the visual narrative. Simba's journey from carefree exile back to rightful king is narrated more through Glover's gradually deepening vocal tone, moving from easygoing melancholy to resolute command, than through any convincing, visible change in his demeanor or posture that visually signifies the weight of his lineage settling upon him. The audience must actively perform the translation from realistic animal behavior to mythic hero arc, a labor the stylized animation once handled effortlessly. Moreover, the very concept of the afterlife and spiritual guidance, central to the African mythos woven into The Lion King, is visually diminished by the film's aesthetic sobriety. Mufasa's appearance is not simply a technical hurdle. It represents the collapse of the boundary between the living and the dead, a necessary moment of magical realism. By rendering the clouds and atmospheric effects with such precise, observable fidelity, the film inadvertently makes the visitation look like a fluke of weather or a trick of the light rather than a transcendent intervention. It is beautiful atmospheric rendering, but it lacks the spiritual shock that fuels Simba's immediate pivot. The ancestors, the very foundation of the Pride Land's moral code, appear as impressive visuals rather than undeniable manifestations of guiding spirits. In conclusion, Favreau's 2019 Lion King functions as an extraordinary technical demonstration of what cinema can achieve in digital replication. It is a stunningly accurate portrait of an idealized African landscape populated by photorealistic fauna. Yet, in succeeding so completely in capturing the look of nature, it often fails to capture the essential feel of myth. The film replaces the expressive shorthand, the deliberate exaggeration, and the spiritual abstraction that made the original emotionally universal with a commitment to plausibility that ultimately renders the epic journey merely plausible, meticulously detailed, but ultimately less mythically resonant. The very choice to adhere so strictly to photorealism necessitates a revision of how characters interact with their environment, often reducing dramatic tension to mere behavioral observation. For instance, the inherent loneliness and alienation Scar feels while watching his brother Mufasa in the prime of his life are supposed to simmer beneath the surface of his every interaction. Chiwetel Ejiofor's delivery excellently conveys this simmering resentment, suggesting an intellectual bitterness born of perceived slight. However, because Scar's physical expression is limited to the repertoire of a real lion, his passive-aggressive movements around Pride Rock, the slight hunch, the averted gaze, are easily misinterpreted as simple feline languor rather than the calculated, repressed rage of a failed philosopher king. The audience must supply the Shakespearean dimension that the visuals refuse to grant. This constraint is even more apparent in the tender moments meant to establish the depth of Simba and Nala's childhood bond. When they playfully wrestle, the sequence is visually acrobatic, showcasing the agility of young predators. But the underlying narrative requirement is that this is the genesis of a deep romantic connection that will later compel Simba out of exile. In the 1994 version, the characters' large, expressive eyes and playful anthropomorphism made their mutual affection instantly readable. Here, the interaction looks exactly like two young lions playing. The human emotion layered on top feels entirely external, dictated by the screenplay rather than emerging organically from the digital clay. Beyonce Knowles Carter's voice projects Nala's concern and eventual desperation beautifully, yet the visual grammar struggles to convey the intimacy required for her plea to carry the necessary emotional leverage over Simba's hedonistic comfort. Furthermore, the film's treatment of the stampede sequence, while a technical tour de force in simulating mass panic, inadvertently serves to isolate Simba further rather than integrate the audience into his trauma. The immense scale of the wildebeest migration, a staggering display of digital physics, mandates that the camera often pull back to comprehend the totality of the disaster. This wide lens fragments Simba's personal tragedy. Instead of being suffocated by the immediate claustrophobic terror of the moment, the sound, the dust, the proximity of death, Simba becomes a small, overwhelmed figure within a grand environmental event. His survival and his subsequent guilt are framed as a consequence of large-scale ecological movement rather than a focused personal catastrophe orchestrated by villainy. The spectacle overshadows the specific defining wound. This overall aesthetic choice leaves the final act feeling less like a confrontation of destiny and more like a necessary administrative cleanup. When Simba returns, the visual palette shifts, but it's a shift back toward the standard vibrancy of nature, not a visual representation of moral elevation. The final battle is a gritty, realistic brawl, devoid of the theatrical staging that once framed the conflict as a battle for the soul of the kingdom. It is a struggle for physical control between two dominant males, executed with brutal efficiency. While the commitment to realism ensures that the violence is shocking in its verisimilitude, it strips the resolution of its mythological catharsis. The restoration of the circle of life is thus visually represented by the simple reassertion of the natural hierarchy, suggesting that Mufasa's legacy was less about spiritual guidance and more about ensuring the strongest predator holds the highest perch, a conclusion far more grounded and far less inspiring than the allegory intended. The film's reliance on seamless digital immersion ultimately creates an uncanny valley effect when dealing with moments intended to transcend reality. This is nowhere more apparent than in the brief yet pivotal interactions involving Rafiki, John Caney's portrayal striving for an ancient, observed wisdom rather than a manic, guiding energy. In the original, Rafiki's often nonsensical, highly stylized movements served to shake Simba out of his complacency. His staff striking the cub was a deliberate, theatrical shock to the system. Here, Kani's mandrill is grounded in observable primate behavior. His wisdom seems to come from deep ecological knowledge rather than prophetic insight. When he presents Simba with the gourd and initiates the reflective trance, the visual effect is less spiritual revelation and more sophisticated environmental hallucination. The audience perceives the realistic rendering of the jungle foliage surrounding them, making the suggestion that Simba is witnessing something beyond the tangible world feel visually unsupported by the very realism the movie champions. This philosophical dilemma also affects the depiction of Scar's true motivation and his relationship with the hyenas. In the prior iteration, the hyenas were visually and morally distinct. They were creatures operating outside the bounds of the circle of life, their grotesque appearance symbolizing their corrupted nature. By integrating Florence Kasumba's Shenzi and her cohorts more fully into the ecosystem's visual design, making them look like authentic, powerful scavengers, the film inadvertently lessens their role as agents of chaos. They become pragmatic survivors attracted by a failing regime, rather than emissaries of darkness. Ejiofor's Scar, brilliant in his articulate bitterness, tries to command them through rhetoric, but the visuals suggest a functional alliance between predators, not a covenant with true evil. The lack of clear visual moral demarcation weakens the inherent conflict between Scar's self-serving isolation and Mufasa's communal responsibility. Moreover, the constraints of realism impede the expression of sheer joy and collective harmony when the film attempts to depict the rebirth of the Pride Lands. The visual climax of the original featured an explosion of stylized color and energetic motion as the rains returned and the new generation was presented. The 2019 iteration shows the immediate aftermath. The dry earth is soaked. The herds return. It is a beautiful, high-definition snapshot of ecological recovery. However, the sheer, unrestrained celebration is absent. The lionesses look relieved, perhaps, but their movements are measured. The overwhelming, unifying emotion that should sweep across the savannah, the collective sigh of a kingdom saved, is replaced by a quiet dignity. The film demonstrates the result of good governance through meticulous visual data, but it struggles to evoke the raw, unbridled feeling of that restoration, a feeling that demands a departure from visual sobriety and an embrace of expressive, even unrealistic, cinematic joy. The final product is a masterwork of digital craft that, paradoxically, struggles most when it tries to capture the one thing that requires deliberate artifice, transcendent emotion. The thematic sacrifice made at the altar of hyper-realism is perhaps most keenly felt in the silent, internalized suffering of Sarabi, Nala's mother figure, and the collective demeanor of the adult lionesses under Scar's oppressive rule. In the 1994 film, Sarabi possessed an undeniable regal bearing. Her sorrow manifested in sharp, controlled defiance and deep-set, expressive eyes that spoke volumes against Scar's flimsy authority. Here, with the visual constraints in place, Sarabi, Expertly voiced with measured dignity by an actress whose full emotional range is visually muted, becomes a stoic symbol rather than an active participant in the court drama. Her silent confrontations with Scar, such as the moment she refuses to let the pride hunt for the hyenas, register as acts of principled yet passive resistance rooted in biological loyalty rather than the profound, emotionally charged stand of a queen defending her people against a tyrant. The camera lingers on the meticulously rendered texture of her fur, but the fire in her spirit is kept barely visible, flickering behind the mask of naturalistic composure. This visual restraint extends to the characterization of the antagonist's followers. The hyenas, as discussed, appear grounded, but this grounding strips them of their symbolic menace. In the original, their ragged appearance and exaggerated, almost skeletal features made them visually antithetical to the lush, balanced ecosystem ruled by Mufasa. They looked like poverty and desperation given monstrous form. In the 2019 version, Shenzi's pack appears strong, healthy, and integrated, suggesting they are simply successful, opportunistic predators. This creates a logical inconsistency. If they are thriving hunters, why is the kingdom starving? The answer, that Scar's mismanagement has simply diverted resources, is rational, but it robs the conflict of its necessary mythological polarity between inherent good and inherent evil. The visual language insists that the hyenas are merely a harsh part of nature, not the embodied, selfish counterpoint to the circle of life. Even the film's attempts to depict the transition of leadership feel visually hesitant. When Simba finally confronts Scar, the visual choreography, while impressive in its execution of lion-on-lion combat, lacks the necessary height and dramatic geometry. The original fight was vertical, taking place on the jagged precipice of Pride Rock, symbolizing the precariousness of high office. Here, the confrontation often descends into a messy, horizontal scramble on the rocky outcrop, emphasizing the physical violence of a territorial dispute over the symbolic weight of reclaiming a birthright. Donald Glover must strain his voice almost to the breaking point to convey the seismic shift in Simba's spirit, the moment the hesitant cub embraces the formidable king, because the visual evidence is constrained to the actions of a large, angry animal defending itself, not a mythic figure stepping into his destiny. The audience is left admiring the stunning depiction of a lion fight, rather than feeling the satisfying snap of destiny falling into place. The film is an immaculate digital diorama, but the moments demanding soaring, unrealistic emotional expression are those that are inevitably clipped by the demands of the lens. The final critical area where the hyper-realistic veneer thins is in the execution of the pivotal circle of life presentation itself, the grand opening sequence that establishes the world's spiritual and hierarchical order. In the 1994 film, the sequence was overtly theatrical. The sunburst lighting, the focused camera movements on the assembled animals, and the sweeping chorus created a moment of pure, unquestioning awe. It felt like a religious ceremony. Favreau's rendition, conversely, functions more like a highly polished National Geographic special on African fauna. The sheer volume of meticulously rendered CGI creatures, the herds moving with perfect, if detached, digital accuracy, is breathtaking as a technological feat. Yet the required emotion is one of reverence, and the visuals deliver observation. The animals don't look up in awe at the newborn Simba. They are simply present, exhibiting the expected behaviors of animals gathered for a large event. This divergence is most poignant in the presentation of the sun as the ultimate source of life and Mufasa's connection to it. In the original, the beams of light were golden conduits of spiritual power. Here, the light is a carefully calculated atmospheric rendering, scientifically plausible volumetric lighting. When Rafiki holds Simba aloft, the light catches the infant's sparse mane in a way that highlights the technical achievement of the render, rather than seeming to emanate from a divine source. It is a beautiful visual moment, but it lacks the visceral, unquestioning belief that the narrative requires. The audience sees a cub backlit by a stunning sunrise. They are not made to feel that the entire world has bowed before its future king. This technical literalism ultimately strips the villains of their necessary mythological resonance. Scar's ambition, driven by intellectual envy and a desire for usurping divine right, is visually undercut by his physical realism. He is a handsome, sleek lion, simply weaker than Mufasa. Without the exaggerated shadows, the more pronounced sinister angles, or the sheer visual wrongness that the animated Scar possessed, his evil becomes one of poor political maneuvering rather than cosmic imbalance. When he is finally defeated, the physical violence of the scene, while realistic, resolves the conflict in terms of a stronger predator winning a brawl, not in the necessary, transcendent victory of good over malevolent corruption. The film ends with a visually perfect Pride Rock restored to its natural state, but the sense of myth, the understanding that order has been divinely reaffirmed, is replaced by the quiet satisfaction of witnessing successful ecological management. It is a world proven to be beautiful, but a myth left only half told. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Takecraft channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. Today, we are going to discuss the movie The Lion King from 2019. The vast sunlit plains of the Pride Lands shimmered under an African dawn, a cradle for the next generation of rulers. We watch a young lion cub, Simba, heir to the majestic throne, presented by his father Mufasa to the assembled kingdom. Mufasa, a figure whose very presence commanded respect. A lion whose reign was marked by balance and wisdom, qualities forged from a life dedicated to upholding the circle of life, held his son aloft. Simba, brimming with the irrepressible energy of youth, soon finds a foil in Scar, his calculating uncle. Scar, whose perceived marginalization from the royal lineage fueled a bitter ambition, often paints dark pictures of the elephant graveyard, a desolate place forbidden by Mufasa. Scar's narrative, often laced with sardonic wit, belied a deep-seated resentment that had shadowed his own artistic, albeit destructive, inclinations. He always seemed to prefer the shadows to the spotlight Mufasa naturally commanded. Driven by curiosity and a thirst for adventure, Simba, accompanied by his spirited friend Nala, ventures into the Forbidden Lands. They are ambushed by the hyenas, Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed, henchmen whose loyalty was bought by Scar's promises of power. Mufasa, ever the vigilant protector, intervenes in a spectacular display of leonine strength, saving his son and reinforcing the dangers that lurk beyond the borders of their responsibility. Scar, undeterred, plots a more elaborate catastrophe. He manipulates Simba into a gorge, a trap sprung during a wildebeest stampede. The sheer volume of the fleeing animals was overwhelming, a testament to nature's indifferent power. Mufasa rushes in, a titan battling chaos, saving his son only to be betrayed by Scar at the precipice. The fall echoes the silent collapse of order in the Pride Lands. Simba, shell-shocked and guilt-ridden, flees the Pride Lands. He is found near death by Timon and Pumbaa, a meerkat and a warthog duo whose philosophy of Hakuna Matata, no worries, offers a seductive, if escapist, alternative to responsibility. Their vibrant, carefree existence in the jungle provides a necessary balm for the traumatized cub, allowing him to mature away from the burdens of kingship, their easygoing camaraderie serving as a temporary sanctuary. Years pass. Simba grows into a powerful young lion, his past effectively buried under the lush canopy. However, the past, much like the relentless African sun, eventually forces its way through. Nala, now a young adult, stumbles upon him. She is starving, having fled the desiccated, overhunted Pride Lands ruled by Scar, whose mismanagement